My father tapped his crystal champagne flute with a silver butter knife, and the sound echoed through the grand ballroom like a warning bell. 200 guests went quiet. The string quartet stopped playing. I was sitting at the sweetheart table in my white lace gown, holding my new husband's hand. Sam was smiling, thinking this was going to be a normal father of the bride speech. I knew better. My father, Richard, stepped up to the microphone, smoothed his custom-tailored Italian suit, and looked out over the crowd. He didn't look at me. He looked at his wealthy business partners at table 1. As a father, you always want the absolute best for your daughter, he began, his voice dripping with that polished corporate warmth he used right before he crushed someone in a negotiation. You want her to soar, to reach the top. He paused, took a slow sip of his champagne, and let his eyes drop to Sam. But I suppose part of growing up is learning to accept when your child decides to stop climbing and simply settle. A collective gasp swept through the ballroom. My mother looked at the floor. My sister smirked. Sam's hand went rigid in mine. My father had just stood up at my wedding and publicly called my husband a failure. He opened his mouth to deliver the punchline. But before he could speak another word, a chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor at the back of the room. Sam's father, Marcus, a man who had worn the same pair of steel-toed boots for 10 years and who my father had treated like the hired help all evening, stood up. I became a pediatric physical therapist. I drove a 6-year-old Honda, and 3 years ago, I fell in love with a man named Sam. Sam is a master carpenter. He restores historic homes. He works with his hands, comes home smelling like sawdust and linseed oil, and treats everyone from the janitor to the CEO with the exact same level of respect. My father hated him immediately. At our first family dinner, my father looked at Sam's calloused hands and asked, "So, you fix cabinets for a living? Is there a franchise opportunity there, or is this just a permanent hobby?" Sam didn't take the bait. He just smiled and said, "I preserve things that are built to last, sir. Something people forget how to do these days." When Sam proposed, my father didn't offer congratulations. He called me into his home office, closed the door, and said, "Maya, you are making a permanent mistake with a temporary man. He will never be able to provide the lifestyle you were raised in." I looked at my father, sitting behind his massive mahogany desk, surrounded by leather-bound books he never read. "I don't want this lifestyle, Dad," I said. I want a partner. My father refused to pay for the wedding. He told me that if I insisted on settling for a blue-collar life, I could fund it myself. So Sam and I paid for everything. We booked a beautiful historic estate on the edge of the city. We paid the caterer, the florist, and the band out of our own savings. My father only RSVP'd yes when he found out the mayor and 3 major investors were attending. He couldn't afford to look like an estranged patriarch in front of his network. But what I didn't know, what no one in our family knew, was that my father's empire was a house of cards, and the wind was already blowing. 6 weeks before the wedding, I stopped by my father's office to drop off the final seating chart. His secretary wasn't at her desk, so I walked straight back. The door was cracked open. My father was on the phone, and his voice was completely stripped of its usual bravado. He sounded panicked. "I just need a 90-day extension," he was pleading. "If Vanguard Capital calls the note due on the Midtown project, I lose the portfolio. I'll lose the house. You have to get me in a room with the principal." I backed away silently and left the building. My father, the man who mocked my fiancé for working with his hands, was on the verge of total bankruptcy. He was drowning in defaulted commercial debt held by a private equity firm called Vanguard Capital. I kept the secret. I didn't tell my mother, I didn't tell my sister, and I didn't say a word when my father strutted into our rehearsal dinner wearing a $4,000 bespoke suit. My father refused to pay for the wedding. He told me that if I insisted on settling for a blue-collar life, I could fund it myself. So Sam and I paid for everything. We booked a beautiful historic estate on the edge of the city. We paid the caterer, the florist, and the band out of our own savings. My father only RSVP'd yes when he found out the mayor and 3 major investors were attending. He couldn't afford to look like an estranged patriarch in front of his network. But what I didn't know, what no one in our family knew, was that my father's empire was a house of cards, and the wind was already blowing. 6 weeks before the wedding, I stopped by my father's office to drop off the final seating chart. His secretary wasn't at her desk, so I walked straight back. The door was cracked open. My father was on the phone, and his voice was completely stripped of its usual bravado. He sounded panicked. "I just need a 90-day extension," he was pleading. "If Vanguard Capital calls the note due on the Midtown project, I lose the portfolio. I'll lose the house. You have to get me in a room with the principal." I backed away silently and left the building. My father, the man who mocked my fiancé for working with his hands, was on the verge of total bankruptcy. He was drowning in defaulted commercial debt held by a private equity firm called Vanguard Capital. I kept the secret. I didn't tell my mother, I didn't tell my sister, and I didn't say a word when my father strutted into our rehearsal dinner wearing a $4,000 bespoke suit. At that rehearsal dinner, my father's arrogance hit a new low. Sam's parents, Marcus and Elaine, had flown in from Ohio. They are quiet, unassuming people. Marcus wore a corduroy sport coat that was at least a decade old. Elaine wore a simple floral dress. They brought us a handmade quilt as a wedding gift. My father treated them like they had wandered in off the street. He seated them at the far end of the room, next to the kitchen doors. When Marcus offered to buy a round of drinks for the table, my father laughed out loud and said, "Save your pension, Marcus. The wine here is probably out of your bracket." Marcus didn't flush. He didn't get angry. He just looked at my father with a calm, unblinking stillness. "I appreciate the advice, Richard," he said softly. I was furious. I apologized to Marcus in the hallway later, but he just patted my arm. "Don't worry about it, Maya," he said, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Loud men usually have the most to hide. Let him talk." That brings us to the wedding reception. My father couldn't stand the fact that he wasn't the center of attention. He couldn't stand that Sam and I had paid for a beautiful evening without his money. So he decided to hijack the toasts to put us in our place, in front of the 200 guests. I suppose part of growing up is learning to accept when your child decides to stop climbing and simply settle. The silence in the ballroom was suffocating. My sister Chloe smirked into her wine glass. My father smiled, raising his flute toward his investor friends, waiting for the polite chuckles that always validated his cruelty. Then, the chair scraped at the back of the room. Marcus stood up. He was wearing an off-the-rack gray suit. He picked up his battered canvas duffel bag, unzipped it, and pulled out a heavy manila folder. He began walking down the center aisle, past the crystal centerpieces, past the stunned guests, past the string quartet. My father frowned. "Marcus," he said into the microphone, "if you're looking for the restroom, it's out the back doors." Marcus didn't stop. He walked all the way to the head table, stopped directly in front of my father, and placed the manila folder flat on the white linen. "I'm not looking for the restroom, Richard," Marcus said. He didn't use a microphone, but his voice was deep and steady, and it carried perfectly in the dead quiet room. "I'm looking for a signature." My father looked at the folder like it was a live snake. "What is this? This is my daughter's wedding. Sit down." "You talked a lot about climbing tonight," Marcus said, keeping his hands resting on the edge of the table. "You talked about settling. You talked about providing. I thought since you were so eager to discuss financial stability in front of 200 people, we should have a transparent conversation." My mother stood up. "Security," she hissed. "Someone get him out of here." Nobody moved. Marcus opened the folder. He pulled out the first document and turned it so my father could read the header. I was sitting 3 feet away. I could see the bold black text at the top of the page. Notice of default and intent to accelerate. My father's face lost every drop of its color. The tan, confident, untouchable millionaire suddenly looked like a man who was about to be sick. "Where did you get that?" my father whispered. His voice trembled. The microphone picked it up, broadcasting his terror to the entire room. "I got it from my desk," Marcus said smoothly. He pulled a second document from the folder. "Because while you were spending the last 3 years mocking my son for having sawdust on his jeans, you were desperately emailing my acquisitions team, begging for a bailout on your Midtown portfolio." My father took a physical step backward. He stumbled against his chair. "Your team?" "I own Vanguard Capital, Richard," Marcus said. The ballroom erupted in a collective gasp. My sister Chloe dropped her wine glass. It shattered against the hardwood floor. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. I sat completely frozen. Sam's dad? The man who drove a 15-year-old Subaru and wore corduroy jackets? He owned one of the most ruthless private equity firms on the East Coast? I looked at Sam. He was looking at his father with quiet pride. He had known the whole time. Marcus placed a third piece of paper on the table. Heavy, legal cardstock with a red notary seal. "I grew up working on a farm, Richard," Marcus told my father, his voice echoing in the vast, silent room. "I built my company from the dirt up. And the one thing I learned early on is that you can always tell a man's true net worth by how he treats the people he thinks are beneath him." My father was hyperventilating. He looked at the investors at table 1. They were staring at Marcus with wide, recognizable awe. They knew who Vanguard Capital was. They knew my father was ruined. "You're in default on $14 million of commercial debt," Marcus said, tapping the paper. "Yesterday morning, my board voted to call the note due. Your company is insolvent. Your assets are seized. As of 9 a.m. yesterday, Vanguard Capital owns everything your name is on." My father reached out, his hands shaking violently. "Marcus, please, we're family now. We can work this out. I was making a joke. It was just a joke." "A joke," Marcus repeated. You stood in front of this room and tried to strip my son of his dignity because he works for a living. You called your daughter a failure for loving him. Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out a silver pen. He set it on top of the document. Sign the asset surrender, Richard. Right here, right now, in front of the daughter you just humiliated. My father looked around the room. He looked for an ally, for an excuse, for a way out. He found 200 people watching him fall from the pedestal he had built for himself. He picked up the pen. His hand was shaking so badly he could barely form the letters. He signed the paper. Marcus picked up the document, checked the signature, and nodded. Then, he did something that still gives me chills when I think about it. He didn't put the paper back in his folder. He turned to me and Sam. Marcus slid the folder and the signed surrender document across the table until it rested right in front of our wedding cake.
"Sam? Maya?" Marcus said, his face softening into the warm, kind smile I had always known. "I transferred the holding company that owns Richard's debt into a new trust this morning. The trust is in your names. Consider it a wedding gift." My father let out a strangled, breathless sound. He looked at me. He looked at the daughter he had just mocked for settling. I was now his landlord. I was his bank. I owned his debt, his company, and his future. "Maya," my father choked out, tears finally spilling over his eyelashes. "Maya, please." I didn't yell. I didn't throw my drink. I looked at the man who had made me feel small for my entire life, and I used the exact same tone he had used to try and break me. "I'd love to help you, Dad," I said quietly, "but I'm just a woman who decided to settle. You shouldn't be asking me for a handout." I turned to the venue coordinator who was standing paralyzed near the kitchen doors. "Excuse me," I said, my voice carrying over the microphone. "I think the man at the microphone needs to be escorted out. He's ruining the atmosphere." 2 security guards stepped forward. My father didn't fight them. He looked completely hollowed out. He walked toward the exit, his custom suit suddenly looking like it belonged on someone else. My mother and sister scrambled out of their chairs and practically ran out the side doors to follow him, their heads down, hiding from the stares of the crowd. When the doors closed behind them, Marcus turned to the DJ. "Play something upbeat," Marcus said. "My son just got married." The DJ hit a button. Upbeat soul music flooded the room. And for a moment, nobody knew what to do. Then, one of the investors at table 1, a man my father had been desperate to impress, stood up and started clapping. The next table joined in. Then the next. Soon, 200 people were on their feet, giving us a standing ovation. Sam pulled me onto the dance floor. We danced for 3 hours. We laughed until our ribs hurt. The next morning, my father's attorney called me. He tried to negotiate a buyout. I told him to speak to my property manager and hung up. We liquidated my father's commercial portfolio, cleared his debts, and used the remaining capital to open a massive new workshop and restoration business for Sam. My father currently lives in a rented 2-bedroom apartment. He works as a mid-level manager for a logistics company. He hasn't spoken to me in a year, and I've never slept better. People think that wealth is about how loud you can be and how many labels you can wear. But the loudest thing in the world is a man with a manila folder telling the truth in a quiet room.